to The Independent Musician. Our weekly podcast will focus on the independent artist and the music market at large. You'll hear from those artists as well as music execs, tech experts, and marketing leaders from around the globe. We'll discuss what it takes to make it in the biz and how you can overcome obstacles as you progress your craft, all the while making it interesting and fun. Now, here's your host, Mark Skoda.
This is your host, Mark Skoda, here at the Independent Musician Podcast, and we have a very special guest today, Mr. Steve Bishir, who is a five-time Grammy Award-winning producer, engineer, and just extraordinary music guy. Frankly, I've known Steve now for a few years, and I'd like to welcome him to the show. Steve, welcome.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So, Steve, we started this podcast to sort of help people begin to think about what's going on in the industry and how they begin to address this in their current state of their careers, the music business generally, and certainly how they move forward. And I know that you've had just an extraordinary experience going back to working, with many, many artists. And of course, as you continue to see your own career evolve, I mean, I think one of the things you're actually had been working with Amy Grant in the past and reproducing one of her update albums, I guess, in a remaster. And more recently, you've been involved in engineering and producing on The Prom on Netflix, and then even for the new series. The name, by the way, escapes me, but it comes out in October with Trace Adkins. What is the name of that show that's coming out?
It's a series called Monarch. It's on Fox Television. It's the new Fox. It's one of their new flagship things. It actually premieres on September 11th. I believe it's after football.
Right. Very good. Well, that's so you've actually gone from the music business. Obviously, you've done a lot of work there. I mean, how many years now have you been sort of in music and in production in particular?
Well, let's see. I graduated college in '88, and I was an assistant for about 18 months before I started engineering stuff. So really, I've been in the music business since '88 officially. But before that, you do local bands and you do all sorts of stuff. So
right.
It's really since I was 10 or 11 years old, I knew that this was what I wanted to do.
That's a story that I keep hearing from so many people I've talked with, artists as well as people in the music business. It's sort of, I knew what I wanted to do from a very young age. And that is sort of a very interesting theme that keeps coming through as I talk to people, certainly through the record label and, even in my son's experience and your experience. Everyone starts this journey early on and really just having an appreciation for the music business generally, and you seem to be no different.
Well, I think it's when you see people who do whatever it is they do in life, they just are that. Like right. Painters, they start painting early. They just can't not paint. And same with, I just always was interested in how records sounded. How do they get that sound? How do they get that kick drum? How do they get those toms? And I had, my favorites of back when I was in high school. It was I wanted the kick drum from the Tubes. I wanted the tom sounds from Neil Peart in Rush, and I wanted cymbal sounds from Phil Collins or somebody. It was
right.
You just pick these things that you want to emulate. An artist that I worked with a number of years ago, his name is Livingston Taylor. He's James Taylor's brother. We did a couple of records.
With him. I remember him actually. Yeah. Right.
Well, he was invited to. He's friends with at that time. He was friends with Steven Spielberg's chef, and he was invited to dinner at the Spielbergs.
Right.
So he was just in the kitchen, talking to his friend, and she was preparing the meal. And Spielberg came in and he had a little camera in his hand, and he goes, wait, no, cut those carrots again. Do it from this way. Do it one more time. And he was setting up shots with a little camera of somebody just cutting vegetables for dinner. And after he left, my buddy asked his friend, said, "Does he do that all the time?" And she said, "Yeah, he's always
filming, right?
Yeah, he's never without a camera in his hand."
Unbelievable. That's a remarkable story.
I think it's just you are what you are.
Right.
You become whatever that is, that thing that you can't not do.
Well, what was your as you came up doing a lot of different types of jobs, what was your first real job coming into the music business? Was it as an engineer? Were you basically a lackey? Were you working for a studio? How did you start your actual paid for a day's work career?
Well, it's it's pretty funny because when I graduated from college, I went to work as an intern for a studio called Omni Sound in Nashville. And my first paid job in the music industry, this would have been in June. So my first paid job in the music industry was cutting the weeds out of the parking lot at Omni.
And I'm very familiar with Omni Studios, obviously,
Yeah,
and we've done some recording down there.
Yeah, and they did. Well, it's just a little parking lot, and
Right.
apparently I cut the weeds successfully enough that they let me start coming in at 1 o'clock in the morning to tear down microphones from the day's session and set up the microphones for the next day's session. And being a poor student, or a poor student of the music business, but a poor person starting out, I usually hung around until after the catered lunch appeared, and then I'd go home. But that, and from that, then I started doing some sessions when we only had one assistant. So when he was tired or needed to be on vacation or take a day off or whatever, I would do that day's session as an assistant. So through that, I met a lot of people, because Omni's a very busy studio and lots of people come through there. So
right.
I met then, through that, I met a producer who I worked with then for 17 years, making records, engineering, co-producing on some, and mixing all of his records for 17 years.
Was that where you basically earned your Grammy stripes?
Yes, with that particular producer, was it all? All 5 of the Grammys that I won we won one from. It was 1999 through 2004. I won one each year.
Wow, very interesting. Well, in the early days of the music business, of course, everything was analog, and you certainly had to cut your teeth on that. And Omni Sound, for those who don't know, is a very famous studio here. As Steve has dated himself a bit, has been around quite a long time. They've had quite a number of famous artists record there.
It was even around before me. So
that's right. There you go. Well, and it's a fantastic studio, great people over there as well. But as you sort of started out in that process and learned a bit about the trade of engineering and production, what began to change, and when did that change occur as it relates to sort of moving towards a more digital platform? Or is basically the music business the same from the days you started? The only difference is the technology's changed. How did you feel about that?
Well, the business is miles different. It's fundamentally different in many ways. The technology is also has moved on and is completely different, but the basic principles still apply. If it's a good song, it's a good song.
Right.
And all the technology in the world is not going to help a bad song be a good song. It might have nice production on it and stuff, but it'll still be a bad song. And production has changed a lot, since, because it was essentially 1990 when I was really starting to make records, and those were all analog, of course.
Probably analog, were the 8-track, or did you have multi-track?
No, it was 2-inch 24-track, and we would have two machines locked up at mix. So you have 48 tracks of material, which is usually, you have less than that because you have a click and some other stuff. So you'd have 40 tracks of material or something. And then we had the next innovation was digital tape recorders, where you had the 32 track, and then you had which was a 1-inch tape, and then you had the 48 track, which started out as a 24 track. The Sony Dash format. It was a 1/2-inch tape that was 24 tracks, and then went to 48 tracks. And 48 track became the standard for a lot of times, maybe analog, and like we did a lot of records where we'd track on analog and then bounce it over to the 48 track to do all the overdubs on. And then at mix, we'd go back and get the original drums and stuff from the analog tape and lock those two machines together.
Interesting.
At mix. And then
so there was a lot of manual activity involved. You didn't have the software as much as you do today either, right?
Right. And editing was all physically cutting the tape apart and putting different pieces in. If you would comp performances that way by recording 3 or 4 performances, and then there's reels spinning all over the place, and you cut a piece of tape and hang it on the wall and cut it into another take. And so it was a really laborious process. Like it would take, you might spend a day just editing a song together.
You mean you didn't have Pro Tools and just a couple of plugins and make the changes?
Oh boy, it was we when the first digital recorders came out. I was around when people were talking about, what if someday you can just put a piece of music where you want it to, and you won't have to move the tape around? And people would go, oh, that'll never happen.
Right.
No. And then here comes Pro Tools, which started out as a 2-track machine, then went to 8 tracks, and then as sound tools, and then it became Pro Tools. And it was in the early days, we did some work with it where we would lock it to an analog machine, and then we would listen to it, and Pro Tools sounded like, well, it sounded terrible. It was really awful sounding because it was 16-bit, which is low resolution. The converters were in their infancy, and
right.
they were not very hi-fi at all.
And well, at that point, it obviously the quality of audio was really dependent on the physical device, the tape and the speakers and the mics. And today, you can manipulate all those digits and basically create a fantastic sounding piece of music. It doesn't have to be great, but it sounds good with all these tools that are available through the software DAWs and, of course, all the plugins. And I think that is, I found it interesting the last time I was at Omni. They got the very large board there that is obviously connected for the mix down, but when they started recording the artists, basically turned along the side of a little desk with a PC and began taking in the various recording tracks in a DAW. And then, so you have these changes in technology which have moved from very large, very expensive studios to essentially, effective rooms, right, that are properly treated for audio. But the technology now is so small, and yet at the same time is so beneficial to produce really quality music.
Well, you can do so much manipulation, and sometimes it gets into the you can do it, but should you do it?
Right.
Because you can just edit the life out of something and make it really sterile. But you also have the ability to say a performance was just incredible, but it was not recorded well, or they were off the mic a little bit, or there were some technical issues. You can fix so many of those technical issues to rescue a performance. And it's also one thing that digital has also done with the advent of Auto-Tune and Melodyne and all these programs that let you make things perfectly in tune and all that kind of stuff, is it's raised the bar of our expectations of what is in tune. Because I'll go back and listen to a record that I did in the early 90s, the mid 90s, and by today's standards, I'm cringing because the vocals way out of tune comparative. Right. But for then it was great.
Well, we've talked a lot about that, and I always love to see these TikToks and various videos where they show it with auto-tune and no auto-tune for these artists that we listen to almost daily. And it's quite marked in some cases. I mean, some of these artists, their obvious inability to carry a melody in a proper pitch is completely fixed by auto-tune. And unfortunately, I think we've lost some of that organic sense. You go back to some of the older records, yes, you're right, they aren't perfect, but they sounded very human at that point. Some of the auto-tune we're seeing today has changed that, hasn't it?
Well, you listen to Frank Sinatra.
Yeah.
One of the greatest voices that's ever been. But he never hit a note in tune, quotation marks, in his life. He slides into things and he hits it just under or just over, just whatever makes the emotional content, deliver the emotional content for something like that. So when you take, and it's the same with grid, when you put everything perfectly in time and everything perfectly in tune, it becomes really boring. It's my analogy. It's like it becomes like cotton candy at a fair. You buy the cotton candy, you eat it, you throw the thing away, you never think about it again because it doesn't move you, it doesn't reach you internally. So and when it's kind of wrong, it lives and breathes. It's more compelling.
Well, I think, and that's also, I think, a very interesting observation, because as we look to music today, a lot of it is almost what I refer to as consumables, right? It's short-lived. We joke about this all the time, but WAP, which in itself was vulgar and horrific in terms of being a rap song, it was number one for the year, but it's something that'll never be remembered again, likely, except for its notoriety or notorious nature as opposed to notoriety. And I think a lot of music today, there's a few producers I watch online, and I call it the cicada hi-hat sound that is in so much of the rap music. It's horrible sounding. It's so fake sounding. Do you see, and yet at the same time, I'll go back just a moment, because of a movie like, or a series like Stranger Things, we have, Running Uphill being a number one from the 1980s, right?
80s, yeah.
I mean, here we are, and the sound of that song and the musicality of that song was quite remarkable. So I sense to be true there, while so much music today is in a genre that has no melodic benefit or very little melodic benefit, that people tend still to appreciate and strive to hear a much more robust, what I'll call, musical element of song that apparently isn't as appreciated today.
I think you're right there. I think that I do some photography stuff as a hobby, and so I was at a wedding doing some photography stuff. It was a friend's wedding, so I was helping them out, and they had a DJ, and it was really interesting the difference between say a Donna Summer tune or a Hall & Oates tune from the 70s. The dance floors filled up, and then a modern tune would come on. He would play something modern, and the dance floor would just kind of peter out. So it is interesting that so many tunes have such life, and they're not perfect, and they're not super tweaked and all that kind of stuff. So but they reach better.
Yeah, I think it's I've sort of looked at the market, and the music I listen to, of course, is a lot of it's still from the 70s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. I quite like classic rock in particular, but at the same time, I think there are some bands that are beginning to show their stuff. There's one band I like, Three Sisters out of Monterrey, Mexico. I've mentioned this before. It's The Warning. They tend to be a sort of what I call light metal, but they're fun to listen to. They're very natural sounding. It's three pieces and no real production, quote unquote. Even their live music sounds just like their album. And I think people can appreciate a band that sounds like they do in person. They don't need to have backing tracks. They don't need to have a whole lot of overdubbing or using overdubbing and even, in fact, some cases lip syncing their own music to produce it. It's amazing to me. The last concert I was right before COVID was Kiss. And I had a laugh. Here I am, a band that I was familiar with and enjoyed in the 80s. Now, the entire venue is absolutely chock-a-block full with 20-somethings. And how does a band that the guys are now 70s and approaching 80 is still rocking it out? Of course, everybody looks good with black wigs and white face paint, right? Yeah. But it tells you something about the market for music, and that's what I think I'd like to explore with you next. Is where do you, as you're working with some of these projects, where do you think things are going? I mean, do you see the pendulum moving back towards more what I'll call traditional bands, traditional music, more melodic music, or are we moving to something else in your view, at least from tangentially your view of the market?
Well, I think there are cyclical things that happen over years. Bruno Mars is an example, who with the band that he had that won the Grammys for the best blues kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. An amazing record. My favorite era of record making is 75 to 85. I think that was the most innovative. And looking back historically, it was the most diverse. It made the most advancements in technology and musical styles during that time.
Right. I would have to agree.
Yeah, and we had you had 70s where things were raw, and they got more and more programmed. And new technology was invented, which came into the 80s and made things a little more sterile. And then that culminated in the hair bands and stuff from the 80s and dance pop stuff. Then it kind of broke down when grunge came in. It went back to its roots, the more angst,
right,
more raw, and then that developed through into again more tweaked and stuff.
But then you had bands like Nirvana and, of course, subsequently Foo Fighters. I mean, people talk about Foo Fighters today. I mean, they are now a 30-year-old band. I mean, it's
right, which is incredible.
It's incredible to think about that, right?
And U2 is a
That's right.
40-year-old band, and
Right.
that's incredible to me because I discovered U2 in the 80s. In 19 Sunday Bloody Sunday was an
Yeah.
eye-opening song, and then I went back and got their first two records. Then that cyclical nature, you have it goes through kind of through a generation, and then the skip the generation, they go back to the roots, and it happens that it's happened that way with technology a bit too, because photography, for example, everything went digital, and then there's been a resurgence of analog photography. There's been in music, there's been a resurgence of turntables, and
Yes.
there's been a resurgence of old technology that's more visceral. It's more random. It has more mistakes.
I call it more human.
Yeah, exactly. And it has more surprise to it. So you have things that are so looking forward now. The thing we have now is there's so much stuff that has splintered into so many little pieces, because you have all these subgenres. You have heavy metal, but you have death metal. You have German heavy. You have all these things, and you have dance music, and you have emo, and you have rave, and you have specific subgenres, and each one of those has its own life. I'm not a big rave person. I don't do that kind of music. I don't do techno a
right.
lot,
Mm-hmm.
but it has its own development, from the Chemical Brothers to Deadmau5 to whoever the next big person is. Then you have in rock, you have Foo Fighters handing over to Maroon 5.
Mm-hmm.
Handing over to whoever the next big thing is in the future. So all of these genres have their own little cycles of growth and rediscovering the old and bringing it to the new. And technology helps a bit with that, because there are analog synths now that are being remanufactured. And analog synths in the 80s and late 70s and through the 80s, analog synths were an amazing sound. Then it turned into digital stuff. Then it turned into just samples of things.
Right. Right.
So it is an interesting thing. And what the future is a lot of it, a lot of music is driven by what's happening socially.
Mm-hmm.
And,
Right.
People embracing it or protesting it. There's all of those things. And I've worked with a lot of different artists and things, and a lot of the sentiment is the same. Say, for example, there will always be a boy meets girl song. Love songs, that's probably 80% of rock and roll and popular music, is relationships of some sort. But the interpretation of that is new with each generation, because each generation has their own slang, their own vernacular, the words morph, the English language morphs, all languages morph and become new meanings and things. So words take on new meanings. So how they get presented in songs become, morphs along with that.
Well, I think, it's also interesting to note, I think we're producing more music than ever before. I mean, I was reading one statistic that Spotify has 60,000 new songs uploaded every single day. So the ability to even manage that amount of content and the segmentation of the genre is obviously necessary, because you're not hearing all that new stuff, although you can find it. You can certainly go out and create these playlists and begin to sample a lot of the new songs that are out there. And I think part of that is because there is, however, so much that we don't have those breakthrough artists. Now, the breakthrough occurs when a big label is able to sort of pull somebody in or identify that next big artist that they want to promote, and they do so, and they do so very effectively. But most artists are independent or with independent labels like Iron Gate, and are really working on their craft by themselves, using the tools at their disposal, in many cases even having home recording studios, and they're able to put out music through various middlemen and other technologies. So I think the democratization of music has resulted in more, but not necessarily better, right? It's like I equate that to the NFL, where they continue to add more and more teams, but there's only so many really great players that come up through the college ranks. And so you end up with fewer superstars, but more mundane. And I think the other thing that's begun to happen, I was really interested to read, is this whole cancel culture that's been occurring. And Beyonce, as you may have read, had just released a record. And in the record, she uses the word spaz. The blowback because of that word against her quote unquote ableist language was so severe that she's taken the word out and recorded it with a different word. And so I wonder sometimes with this woke culture, how much we are creating a conformity in the music as well. And that's something I think artists obviously are very aware of, but also I think the culture needs to be careful because you tend to then homogenize everything given the various self-interests that occur out there. So some of the music from the 60s and 70s would not be allowed to be produced today. It's not culturally right, but yet it's still great music. So I'm always thinking of Dire Straits, right? Some of their music would today be really inundated with the woke culture. But having said that, I think there is beginning to see some pushback against that because artistry is just that, and it's not intended to hurt people. It's sometimes, as you pointed out a moment ago, it's a social commentary. The 60s was all of that, right? I mean, good gosh, growing up then, it was all about war. It was all about the social unrest. It was all about the issues within civil rights movement, and the music was fantastic, and it was creative, and it was unique, and the lyrics were extraordinary because they told stories of the human condition, and I think that's important. That's important for music. I think it is a catharsis for people when they get that kind of content presented to them that is both interesting commentary, extraordinary in terms of the musicality, but not, of course, gangster rap that we also see, the sort of negativity that some of that feeds into, and just the viciousness and frankly some of the violence that comes through in some lyrics. So I think it's a double-edged sword, isn't it?
Well, yeah. I mean, when you go for the lowest common denominator, then you get lowest common music. When people really strive, there was a movement in the 70s with bands they spent all their time trying really hard to become better players because they wanted to be studio musicians. Mm-hmm. Then you had people who, in the 80s, you could program things and you started to be able to fix things. So people became lesser musicians because they wanted to be rock stars.
Right.
And a lot of that has, the linear part of that, when Pro Tools started, I know a lot of musicians who suddenly became incredibly lazy. They would play one thing and say, you can fly that, right? So they would just, flying is copying and pasting part from here to the next to the next. And that just lessens things. And I got a single from, my wife used to work at a record label, and she sent me a single from a new single from an artist. And I listened to it, and then I started examining it more, and they had taken the music and everything from all three choruses and just flown them down the song. He hadn't re-sung anything. He hadn't actually, performed the song. So you come out of the bridge, the last chorus should have the biggest energy. It should have, that's the payoff chorus. It takes you to the end of the song and tells the finishes the story and all that. And when it came out of the bridge, you have this bridge energy going, building, back to the first chorus energy, because that's what it was flown. I think it did pretty well as a single, but it was such an example of lazy record making all the way from the artist to the producer to the A&R guy at the label to the label itself. And nobody's saying, well, that the energy's not right in the last chorus. And I think there's a lot of, I think people are maybe not as brave in some ways, where you have Jimmy Iovine, for example.
Yeah.
He would send records back all the time, says, you don't have the single. It's not a record yet. And one example of that was Creed, where they're talking about Drops of Jupiter.
Oh yeah,
Train.
right.
So they had finished that record, and he refused it. He said, you don't have the single. And they were sitting around in the studio depressed. The producer was telling me this. They were sitting around in the studio, and they were depressed, going, well, what do we do now? He just refused our record. And the lead singer said, well, I've got this thing. I've never finished it. And he started playing Drops of Jupiter.
Oh, wow.
And
that was it.
The producer said, we all started throwing stuff at him. Said, why didn't you play it? What do you mean? This is awesome. This is the song. And sure enough, that song made that record sell 9 million copies or some ridiculous amount.
Amazing.
And another example would be John Kolodner. He was an A&R guy for Aerosmith. And on the Pump album, he refused the album. Said, you don't have the song. So they went back in and came up with Janie's Got a Gun. So
of course,
having somebody who sees that it's not complete and sends it back, has the bravery to refuse it, send it back, is a thing that I think is a good quality.
I agree. It's interesting. One of the things I try to encourage everybody, and even my son's band and other artists that we have on the label here, is, really be the best musician you can be first and foremost. Because as a good musician, you'll play well, and people will want to hear you. And then write as many songs as you can write. Continue to write all the time, because, to paraphrase a conversation, how do you write a good song? Well, you won't, but you keep writing until you finally do. And I think at the end of the day, you have to have that person who's going to gut check you and say, in fact, this is either good or not good, and we need to work this over again. And I think that is important. That's why I call this a craft, because it is about honing your skills. It's about those, I hate to say it, the 10,000 hours that you've practiced and worked on your craft and gotten really good, because that will allow you to be successful. And success today in the music business is defined as many different things. It's not necessarily being in front of that 50,000 person crowd. Those stadium crowds are fewer and further between. But in fact, touring and people listening to you and having those super fans around the country, that's what success is about to many. Or just playing some great music, enjoying it for a small hometown crowd that is sort of your favorite fans, and being satisfied that you're producing the very best product, the very best song, under the very best musicianship that you possibly can. Those are the things that musicians today have to make a decision about, and in particular independent musicians who perhaps have that day job in addition to what they do in the evenings as they perform.
Sure, and you have to understand as well that the music you make today is a snapshot of today.
Right.
It's where you are as an artist today. Where you are as an artist tomorrow, maybe something completely different. So you finish today's music and you move on, you experience life, you write new songs and interpret that next day into your next set of materials, so people, and going, an example in movie making is going back to Spielberg again. He was in an interview one time, and I remember this phrase. It was really interesting, because he said, I have never finished a movie. I only run out of time and money.
Yes.
So he moves on. It's the next project, the next thing. And artists should be, because if you don't grow, if you don't explore new things, if you don't try to stretch yourself, you die as an artist, because you don't bring anything new to what you're doing. So if you're not interested in what your own stuff, nobody else is going to be.
That's correct. That's exactly right.
And as making a record, some of the best records, my most favorite records of the times that I've worked are the ones where the record company either had kind of written us off or were not interested, and so we just made our own record. We made the record that we liked, and there was one in particular where it was with an artist, and she was contractually obligated to release a record. So she started making a record, and we made this particular record in 37 days, from inception to through the mix, 37 days, which is pretty quick for making a record in the traditional way.
Right.
And the record company was like, it's going to turn in a record. We don't care what it is. But then the radio department came into the studio one day and started listening to our songs, and they went, wait, we can play that. We can play that. We can play that. We've got 4 singles we can do off this record. And the record ended up selling over gold, almost platinum.
Wow, that's amazing.
So a lot of it is, you have to please yourself. You have to enjoy what you're doing, and you have to believe in your own stuff, or nobody else will.
Well, that's right. And I think as artists, that's why they call it being an artist, right? I mean, you have the canvas before you, and you paint the picture, or you create the song, and you create the music, and you're always pushing forward. And sometimes you're going to get knocked down, but it's still your music. It didn't exist a moment ago until you wrote it and played it and recorded it and sent it out. And in that sense, the creative spirit in music is so extraordinary, and I believe that's why so many people are still going into music and still pursuing careers in music and still producing so much music. And I want to turn now to that question in a moment, because one of the other things you are engaged in, besides helping mentor and teach people production and engineering, you actually run an entire department for a college here in Tennessee, at Vol State, and you are always encouraging young people to come into the music business, into production and entertainment field. Can you tell us a little about that? And what are you seeing today with these young people? Where Are they as skilled or more so in the past, or are they moving into a career path that they're still excited about, much like you did yourself years ago? Love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I am the director of the entertainment media program at a 2-year school named Volunteer State Community College. It's in Gallatin, Tennessee, which is just north of Nashville. And I've been doing that for 10 years now. Over the years, it's been an interesting thing because we're always trying to keep up with new technology, and curriculum always changes because you're looking at what's coming and what industry will need to be able to properly educate students. But it's also the way students think and the way each generation. Sometimes it's semester to semester. Sometimes it's year to year. In the last couple of years, there's been a really big shift. I mean, the shutdown, we had to do a bunch of online stuff, which is not very effective in teaching skill classes. And that generation, unfortunately, got a bit shortchanged just because of what happened.
Mm-hmm.
But now coming back on this side of it, looking at the enthusiasm of a lot of the students is really, really great to see because they're coming in interested, and they're coming in interested in different ways of making records, because the way I grew up making a record, there were clearly defined roles. You had a producer, you had an engineer, you had a string arranger, you had the musicians, you had the artists. They're very defined roles. The role of engineer started to split before that, but now it's really split completely between engineer and mixer. People who just do the final mix on things. But now a lot of that stuff, all of those lines have been blurred now over the last few years with technology, Pro Tools, and all the other DAWs out there, because you aren't one person. You are a producer today. You're writing the songs. You're engineering the songs. So the way we teach has morphed a bit from just being an engineer to, all right, here's how to engineer your stuff for you. You're having to individualize instructions, so students have the ability to take what they need and apply it how they need to apply it, because everybody's path is different. Every single person has a different path of either wanting to do cinematic music or music for video games, or they're a pop artist, or they're a rap artist, and there are different techniques that apply to all of those things. So it keeps us on our toes, to keep the program fresh and to keep developing new classes and using new techniques. And like right now, we're building one of the old studios. We have 3 studios on the campus, and the oldest one, we're getting ready to convert it into an Atmos control room.
Oh, sure, for
because
music, for movies.
Atmos is here, and Atmos is an interesting environment. It's 360 fully immersive audio. Of all those surround sort of things, I think personally that it has the best chance of staying around because you can enjoy it, at least a lot of aspects of it, in headphones. It's a technology you can take with you. To enjoy the full 100%, of course, you have to be in the sweet spot, as it were, in the middle of all the speakers and don't move. But now all of these car manufacturers, Tesla being the first, and all of the rest are following suit, are installing Atmos systems in cars. So, when you're driving, that's a perfect place to enjoy that immersive audio.
And I think it bodes well for the music industry generally, because what it's saying is that you're not just doing drums and a beat. You're actually having to have an entire mix of instrumentation to, frankly, make that interesting, because it is again, I go back to the musicality. And so that's a good omen, I think, for the industry, because we're not losing ground. The game continues to change. It'll change some more. But obviously, as you educate people for the future, they're still enthusiastic about the music business, which is good news. And we're building more innovation and building young minds that will ultimately be the next rung of the ladder coming into the music business, so that guys like you and I that enjoyed going and listening to the 60s, 70s, and 80s now might just say, you know what, that 2032 song was pretty darn good.
Well, and I think, too, if we stay relevant, which you have to push yourself to stay relevant about new music and new technologies, new ways of doing things, all that sort of stuff. You have, as you get older, you have a better perspective, because all the good things about things you've been through, and you can pull those forward and how to apply things and how to, at least you should. You should remember what you've done, but you also are looking to the future. So, and you can look at kids who come in with this amazing energy, and they don't know what they're not supposed to be able to do.
Yes. So
they go ahead and do it. And you look back on the days, and same way. I've had things I've come away going, well, I don't think I was supposed to do that, but it sure sounds cool,
That's right. And I think these young kids now, these younger guys, are coming in out of a technology background. They've teethed on it, and so it is the tool sets that they're using are second nature. So now they're able to focus more on the creative side, and I think that's good news for the industry.
Well, anybody who tries to push boundaries and explore things, like Frank Zappa explored all kinds of weird things back in his day. And you had Imogen Heap in a previous generation. Now you have, say, somebody like Billie Eilish, who tries to explore different things. And you have whoever the next artist is who comes out and is incredible. But it's also encouraging to see students come in with playlists that there's rap in there, there's country, there's stuff, whatever their super subgenre is. Mm-hmm. It's really diverse, and it is being able to find those things that make you interested.
And I think that is exactly what the music business has always been about. It's been about finding that which interests you, continuing to innovate, and that's why, as a musician and certainly as a producer and engineer, we're going to continue to see that innovation. Steve, we're at the end of our time. I can't thank you enough for all of your time today, and appreciate your insights, and certainly I hope that our audience does as well. Thank you for joining us on The Independent Musician, Steve.
It has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
Thanks for joining us this week on The Independent Musician. Make sure to visit our website, IronGateRecordsRadio.com, where you can subscribe to the show on your favorite streaming platform, so you'll never miss an episode. While you're at it, if you found value in this podcast, we'd appreciate you giving us feedback or simply tell a friend about the show. Be sure to tune in next week for a new episode of The Independent Musician, where the independent musician is the star.